that very generous introduction. I'm honored to speak at the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy. And thank you, Emma, for organizing this event. And thank you all for participating in today's event. So let me first share this screen. Okay, great. Okay. Well, today we can talk about China's vaccine diplomacy. Well, I'm first going to sort of introduce what the vaccine diplomacy is and what are the contexts and motives for China to engage in vaccine diplomacy, and what exactly China is doing in promoting the vaccine diplomacy. And that will be followed by a preliminary assessment of the effectiveness of China's vaccine diplomacy and what are the implications for U.S. foreign policy. So speaking of vaccine diplomacy, well, this is the, this term itself, I think is coined by Dr. Peter Hotez, who defined it as the branch of global health diplomacy that relies on the use or delivery of vaccines. With that, this term, vaccine diplomacy, first appeared in an article he authored, I believe, in 2001. But the history of vaccine diplomacy, of course, is much older, than this. We could, trace it to at least the 1960s, right, when the USSR and the United States cooperate, right, to provide the vaccines for the eradication of the smallpox. Actually, smallpox became the first pandemic, that was eradicated, through vaccination. That was followed by, this efforts, to actually use this vaccination days, to promote a ceasefire in this conflict-ridden countries or regions. So when there's a day for the vaccination, say, okay, why don't we have a ceasefire? This is what they call the days of tranquility, for immunizations. That actually helped to promote peace. Right? They were also more recently in 2009, for example, many countries, including the United States and China, work together, sharing the information, the virus samples, in mass producing the H1N1 vaccines. But speaking of the China's vaccine diplomacy, actually before that, let me make it clear: the Chinese, officially, they don't like this term vaccine diplomacy because that might suggest their motives are no longer humanitarian or altruistic. But it is very clear, right? Like in anywhere else, but there's no free lunch, right? This vaccine, the supply of the vaccines to other countries, certainly, but they have foreign policy objectives in mind. For China, I think there's several reasons on why China launched this vaccine diplomacy. We're going to explain this one by one, but let's first of all talk about what is the beginning of this vaccine diplomacy, right? Certainly, what in terms of the background, it is unfolded in the COVID outbreak. That started in December 2019 in China, actually in Wuhan, and it was initially you might see this this screen. This is the article I published on January 23rd in New York Times, with the title, "Is China Setting Itself Up for Another Epidemic?" I posted this here because when I was reading that this long article written by Larry Wright, a New Yorker, he was talking about like on January 28th. That was 5 days later, when the former president, the President Trump, was briefed by his national security team, on the outbreak, and he asked, this outbreak is going to be similar to SARS. Then his advisors basically told him, that we don't know. I said, what? When I was reading that, say on January 23rd, at least, I mentioned, that this is going to be at least another SARS outbreak. And certainly, right, on January 23rd, right, the President Xi Jinping, actually on January 22nd, he launched the order, the lockdown of Wuhan, after it was very clear, this is the virus that could cause human-to-human transmission. But that lockdown was itself a response to the initial mishandling of the outbreak. Where you saw this strong parallel between the SARS outbreak and the COVID outbreak. In terms of the initial inaction, in terms of the lack of transparency. When the central leaders, recognized, the seriousness of the crisis, they immediately took, decisive measures. It was a torrent of actions being launched, right? Including by those, lockdown of Wuhan, that was then extended to other parts of Hubei province and other parts of China. But the government was also very effective in terms of containing the spread of the virus. So basically within like 10 weeks, right, it was able, to contain the virus spread. In fact, if you look at the figure here, this chart here, right, this by mid-February, we basically this outbreak reached this inflection point, which was followed by a dramatic drop in the number of new cases. Right. So if you actually look at the daily new case count, including both confirmed and suspected cases, right, since early April, that is when they lifted the lockdown in Wuhan. It was basically each day, they were rarely like exceeding like 100 cases, per day. So compared to the United States, which just weeks ago we have seen like a daily new cases of more than 100,000. That was indeed very impressive accomplishment. So, when the situation became stabilized in China, and the government started to, send masks and other medical supplies, even the medical personnel overseas, right? Certainly, one of the objectives is to repel this image, right, that was tarnished by this initial mishandling of the outbreak. But in the meantime, right, they also helped, right, the countries that were reeling from the pandemic, to combat the virus. We have seen, for example, this is from the Reuters news by April 1st, 2020. Thank you, China. Mexico was grateful for China's coronavirus medical supplies. We found this similar, praise of, China, in countries like Serbia and Italy. But in the meantime, this mask diplomacy was tarnished by the quality control issues. They were, later found in many of the OECD countries, that the masks sent from China had quality issues, and there was also the official propaganda, that also damaged the reputation of China's mask diplomacy. Right, there was this reports, suggesting that in one state of the United States, that the local, the council, the Chinese diplomat basically asked the state governor, to write a thank you note to them, so that actually didn't help, right, them to improve its image, so the mask diplomacy, while it was helpful in helping other countries, right, fighting the coronavirus. It also was not very well received in OECD countries. So they want to launch this vaccine diplomacy where the mask diplomacy failed, right? So you can summarize the 4 objectives China's vaccine diplomacy. The first, they want to improve China's image, that was tarnished by the initial mishandling of the outbreak, and also to present China as a responsible great power. And secondly, they want to use the vaccine diplomacy, especially right, the vaccine development, to showcase China's high-tech prowess. I think in the beginning of the development of vaccines, right, the Chinese scientists did not even try to hide the ambition, to be the first to successfully develop a vaccine. Third, they want to also use the vaccine to reinforce, to cement the ties to countries that are strategically important to China in regions like Southeast Asia or South Asia. And finally, they want to expand the market share of the China-made vaccines. But certainly there's commercial incentives being involved for the vaccine makers. There was this estimate that even China occupy, like 10% of this share of the market in the developing world, that is going to be translated into like $1 billion, of profit, for Chinese vaccine makers. So that commercial incentive is also very strong. So let me briefly talk about China's vaccine development, right? The China's vaccine development, started as early as January 2020, and actually by February, they already developed the vaccine for clinical trials. And secondly, unlike the United States and many other countries, Chinese vaccine development is a state-driven process, right? The state, played a critical role in terms of mobilizing the resources, the capabilities for the development of the vaccines. For that purpose, they adopted, 5 technological approaches, which include this inactivated vaccines, like those vaccines developed by Sinovac and Sinopharm or CNBG. CNBG, by the way, is a subsidiary of Sinopharm. And there's also, they have the recombinant protein vaccines, including the mRNA technology. The adenovirus vector vaccines that were developed by the Casino in a partnership with the Academy of Military Medical Sciences, we call it AMMS. It was led by General Chen Wei, the leading virologist. Each of these approaches has 1 to 3 R&D teams in charge. And just to give you an example of this vaccine based on this, the adenovirus vector technology. So this vaccine called AD5-nCoV, it was developed in February. It started phase 1 clinical trial on March 16th. And in late May, they already published results in Lancet magazine. And in late June, they attained the authorization for emergency use for the military. I'm sorry, there was this repetition in late June. And according to General Chen Wei, who's the lead scientist in developing the vaccine, right? The successful entry to clinical trials of vaccines with independent intellectual property rights is an embodiment of our country's science and technological progress, an embodiment of China's great power image and responsibility, and even more, contribution to humankind. And China, well, but because China had a few cases, so in order to conduct the clinical trials, the phase 3 clinical trials, which required large pool of the volunteers. They had to conduct the trials overseas, right? So this shows, those countries, that partner with China, the 3 vaccine makers in phase 3 clinical trials. So for CMBG or Sinopharm, they have been doing the clinical trials in Argentina, or at least plan to, Argentina, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Peru, and the UAE. I think the focus was in UAE. For Sinovac, they conducted the trials in Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey. They were planning to do it in Bangladesh. Although, whether they actually did it, I'm not so sure. CanSino did the trials in Pakistan, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, I believe. So this just shows where they conducted the clinical trials. Those countries that partner with China in developing vaccines also end up buying the China-made vaccines. So what are the results of these clinical trials? For Sinopharm, all the 3 vaccine makers, they now have unveiled the interim results for their vaccines. Sinopharm, Sinovac, they released the results in December. Sinopharm, say that they have the 79% efficacy rate of their vaccines. Although the UAE, they reported efficacy rate of 86%, that is even higher. For Sinovac, they actually reported a different efficacy rate in different countries, right? In Turkey, there was a higher efficacy rate, 91%, not the not actually, we was almost close to the efficacy rate reported by Pfizer and Moderna. Indonesia, they only reported 68% efficacy rate. And in Brazil, it was even lower, right? Barely made the cutoff requirements of the WHO, right? That is 50%. CanSino just yesterday announced the interim results of their phase 3 clinical trials. This is like AstraZeneca, it was a one-shot regimen. But they say that they have 66% efficacy rate. So that is similar to AstraZeneca's vaccines. What are the promises of China-made vaccines? But according to President Xi Jinping, he made this announcement in the World Health Assembly in May 2020 that the Chinese vaccines would be a global public good. Although, we still don't know exactly what he means by global public good. But China has promised, many developing countries the priority access to their successful vaccines. They make promises in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and South Asia, etc. And in October, China joined the COVAX pillar, this program supported by WHO, CEPI, and Gavi to ensure global equitable access to the vaccines. So these are the countries, regions, that plan to obtain the China-made vaccines. So you can see it's almost all the major regions in the developing world, right? In Southeast Asia, you have Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Myanmar. In fact, Singapore is unique in that it's not considered a developing country. Right? But they're also interested in China-made vaccines. In South Asia, like Pakistan, the traditional ally of China, they are interested in China-made vaccines. In the Middle East, Bahrain, Turkey, and the UAE, they want the Chinese vaccine as well. In Africa, interestingly, so far we can only identify 2 countries. Neither of them is in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Egypt and Morocco, they're Northern Africa. They are plan to acquire China-made vaccines. In Latin America, it was Chile, Peru, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. Most of these countries have forged partnerships with China in developing the vaccines. Interesting also, in 3 European countries also want to buy China-made vaccines, but they are Hungary, Serbia, and Ukraine. So I think, if you look at the number of countries who are interested in China-made vaccine, it's very clear, right, that China's vaccine diplomacy actually helped, mitigate those access gap, right, between the developing countries and the developer world, right? Because if you look at the vaccines that were already pre-ordered, most of them, this order were made by the developed countries. In some countries like Canada, right, each citizen, actually on average, reserved 5 to 10 doses of the vaccines. That for a country like Hungary, even though it's considered like a EU member, right, it was unable to, or it was, it couldn't afford to buy, those Western vaccines, so they actually turned to China for help. But the concerns also is that I think there's 3 major concerns when China tried to practice the vaccine diplomacy and project its influence. The first concern is this dilemma between the China's domestic vaccine needs and international demands for China-made vaccines. We know I actually recently published a piece, New York Times, actually talking about how when China, right, they have 1.4 billion people, right? When we talk about a vaccine, achieving herd immunity, right? According to the research, the formula that was published in the Lancet magazine, this basically, right, for China to achieve herd immunity, you need to at least have 70% of the population vaccinated. And that is actually assuming that they have an efficacy rate of the vaccine more than 90%. We know that is very likely not the case. So according to the research, if the vaccine's efficacy rate is below 80%, pretty much you need to have the whole population vaccinated. So that means, China, at least you need to have 2 billion doses of the vaccine in 2021. I mean, this year, right? But China, according to the official the projections, they have the annual vaccine manufacture capacity of 2 billion for 2021. So that you would barely meet the domestic needs, but if all the vaccines produced in China are used for domestic needs, right? But that means you won't be able to earmark a proportion of your vaccines for international needs for the purpose of practicing the vaccine diplomacy. But if you export a large quantity of the vaccines for international needs, right, for vaccine diplomacy, then you won't have enough for domestic needs. So that is one dilemma. That dilemma might explain why, beginning early January, China seems to no longer, make those concrete pledges, supporting, those developing countries to access China-made vaccines. In fact, after the Minister of Foreign Affairs wrapped up his trip, in January in sub-Saharan Africa, he didn't make any single commitment on China-made vaccines. So that certainly would be a concern, because those countries who had high expectations of China-made vaccines, they might feel like China has overpromised, right? So that doesn't help certainly China to improve its image, right? To project a soft power in these countries. Second is there's also a concern of the lack of transparency and the low efficacy rate of the China-made vaccines. We already just talked about that the China-made vaccines, that they are compared to the Western vaccines, you don't have a very high efficacy rate. So if they were exported to the developing countries, for a vaccine that has efficacy rate below 80%, those countries, they might have to have the entire population vaccinated, right, in order to achieve herd immunity. And the lack of transparency also didn't help, right, because even though China has unveiled the interim results of their vaccines, they only in a way it was less forthcoming than the Russia, right, in terms of revealing data, on how many cases, right, were infected, how many people actually were administered with the vaccines and got infected, how many people were taking the placebos and getting infected. This kind of data were very often missing in the official announcement. That certainly raises concerns on the safety and the the quality of the China-made vaccines. Right? There's actually another concern I didn't mention here, is that most of the vaccines so far seems to, in terms of their phase 3 clinical trial, they were not tested among the elderly people, those who are aged over 60. That might explain why, so far, even in China, those vaccination campaign try to exclude those people who are aged over 60. And finally, China also has to face the competition from other vaccine makers, such as the SRI, and AstraZeneca, countries like India and Russia. This shows the countries that has bought the China-made vaccine, as the two China the vaccine makers Sinovac and Sinopharm, right? If you look at this, I think I'm sorry, I'm colorblind, but if you look at those squares, here and there, that I believe one is green, the other maybe blue, but this is still, right, a relatively small share, right, of the total vaccines manufactured worldwide, that have been been contracted by countries, right? So China has to face the competition, from the other vaccine makers, including the vaccine maker, this Russia, right? The Russian vaccine maker, right? If you look at, actually this make it very clear, right? If you compare, right, that with Sinovac and Sinopharm, that it is actually matching, the market share, right, in the developing world. So Russia will be actually also a formidable competitor, to China-made vaccine, to China in terms of supplying vaccines to the developing world. So what about the United States, right? If you look at the Trump administration, in fact, an argument can be made. China was, in a way, successful in practicing its vaccine diplomacy precisely because the United States was not a player, right? We know that the Trump administration was not interested in U.S. global health leadership, right? It withdrew from the WHO. It actually didn't make any public announcement on supporting developing countries in accessing the vaccines. Right. That being said, the U.S. was indeed successful, right, in developing their vaccines through this Operation Warp Speed, right? I think the U.S. became the fact that the U.S. was the first to successfully develop a vaccine actually showcased the U.S. soft power. And if the U.S. successfully achieved herd immunity through their mass vaccination campaigns, it would actually send a very strong message to the world that America is back, that we are indeed the global leader. So that is why I say this mass vaccination campaigns now being underway in the United States is a litmus test of the U.S. Strength and resilience. And we know the new administration now has indicated that they will join the COVAX. They will also very likely participate in the vaccine diplomacy, although in their own way. So, I think China will soon face another competitor in practicing their vaccine diplomacy. But I also hope, that created opportunities for the two countries to cooperate with each other, to narrow the gap, between the developing and the developed countries in terms of vaccine access. So with that, I'm going to stop there.